Ricky Donald Ross sat in the holding cell of the San Diego Federal Courthouse, his wrists bound by steel cuffs that clicked softly whenever he shifted his weight. At 36 years old, he carried himself with the bearing of someone who'd already lived 3 lifetimes, each more impossible than the last. His dark eyes held a peculiar quality, neither hardened nor soft, but watchful in a way that suggested he'd learned to read the invisible currents that moved through rooms before they became visible to others. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with that particular frequency that burrows into your skull during long waits, and Rick found himself counting the buzz cycles, a meditative practice he developed over countless hours in spaces designed to make men feel small. He wasn't a large man by prison standards, 5'11", maybe 180 pounds, but there was something about the way he occupied space that commanded attention. It wasn't aggression exactly. It was more like the quiet certainty of someone who'd negotiated million-dollar cocaine deals before he could legally drink, who'd employed half of South Central Los Angeles during the crack epidemic's peak, and who'd done it all while functionally illiterate. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd built an empire on handshake deals and mental mathematics that would have impressed Wall Street traders, all because he couldn't read the contracts that might have protected him. The door opened with that institutional clang that ricochets through your chest cavity. 2 U.S. Marshals entered, their faces professionally blank. Rick knew that look. He'd seen it on cops, lawyers, judges, and fellow inmates. It was the look people wore when they were delivering news that would devastate you but couldn't afford to show they cared. He stood without being asked. "Time to see the judge, Ross," the taller marshal said. His name tag read Henderson. He had kind eyes that didn't match his job. Rick nodded once. "I'm ready." But was anyone ever really ready to hear their life reduced to a number? Life imprisonment. The words had been floating in his lawyer's warnings for months, but Rick had held on to a sliver of hope that seemed increasingly foolish now. His attorney, a public defender named Mitchell, who looked perpetually exhausted, had laid out the facts with brutal honesty. The government had all the evidence they needed, courtesy of a sting operation that involved their own informant. That informant happened to be his old associate, someone Rick had trusted, someone who'd worn a wire and orchestrated the entire deal that brought him back into the game after he'd been trying to go straight. The courtroom was surprisingly empty for a case of this magnitude. Rick had expected media, protesters, something. Instead, there were just the usual players, prosecutors who'd built their careers on the war on drugs, a handful of court officials, and Mitchell, who gave him a tight smile that said everything they both already knew. The judge, a silver-haired woman named Judith Williamson, had a reputation for being tough but fair. Rick wondered which of those qualities would win out today. As he sat at the defense table, his mind drifted back to a different courtroom years ago when he first understood how the game was rigged. He'd learned then that the same government prosecuting him now had been perfectly content to let cocaine flood into his neighborhood when it served their purposes. Danilo Blandon, his original supplier, had connections to the Contras in Nicaragua, the very rebels the CIA was funding in their shadow war against the Sandinistas. The drugs had been a fundraising mechanism, and Rick had been the distribution network, though he hadn't known it at the time. He'd just been a kid from the wrong side of Los Angeles, a tennis prodigy whose dreams of college scholarships evaporated when he couldn't read well enough to meet academic requirements. When Blandon had offered him cocaine at prices so low it seemed impossible, $25,000 for a kilo when everyone else was charging $50, Rick had seen opportunity. He'd seen a way out of poverty for himself, his family, and his community. He'd employed people, provided income in neighborhoods the government had abandoned. Was it legal? No. Was it moral? That question had more complexity than the legal system allowed. "All rise," the bailiff announced, and the courtroom creaked to its feet. Judge Williamson entered with the brisk efficiency of someone who'd done this 10,000 times. She settled into her seat, arranged her papers, and looked directly at Rick. For a moment their eyes met, and he thought he saw something flicker there, recognition perhaps, that the man before her was more than the case file suggested. But then her professional mask returned. "Mr. Ross," she began, her voice carrying the weight of institutional authority, "you've been found guilty of conspiracy to distribute cocaine. Before I impose sentence, do you have anything you'd like to say to the court?" Mitchell leaned over, whispering urgently, "Rick, you don't have to." But Rick was already standing. He thought about this moment, rehearsed it mentally 100 times. The words came easier than they had in the past. He'd been working on his reading in prison, slowly building the literacy that might have changed everything if he'd had it earlier. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steady, "I'm not going to stand here and say I'm innocent of selling drugs. I did that. I know I did wrong." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "But I also know that the same government prosecuting me today was the one that made it possible for me to get those drugs in the first place. Danilo Blandon, my supplier, he was working with the CIA. They knew where those drugs were going, what they were doing to my community. They didn't care then. They only cared when it became politically convenient to prosecute the war on drugs. The prosecutor, A sharp-featured man named Davidson shifted in his seat but didn't interrupt. I employed hundreds of people, Rick continued. I gave jobs to folks who couldn't get them anywhere else. I'm not saying that makes it right, but I'm saying the story is more complicated than cocaine dealer gets caught and goes to prison. There are people in this government who should be sitting where I am, but they won't ever see the inside of a courtroom. Judge Williamson's expression remained neutral, but she nodded slightly, acknowledging she'd heard him. Mr. Ross, I appreciate your candor. However, the law is clear about the crimes you've committed, the quantity of drugs involved, the scope of your operation. These demand serious consequences. Rick sat down knowing what was coming. His heart was pounding, but he kept his face composed. He'd learned early that showing fear was the quickest way to become a victim. The judge continued, outlining the federal sentencing guidelines, the mandatory minimums, the enhancements that applied to his case. The words blurred together, a litany of legal terminology that built toward the inevitable conclusion. Finally, she arrived at the moment that would define the rest of his life. Ricky Donald Ross, I hereby sentence you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The words landed like physical blows, each syllable another year stolen life without parole. He would die in a cage, payment for crimes that the government had helped create, profited from, and then prosecuted when it became advantageous. Justice of it burned in his chest, but he didn't let it show on his face. He simply nodded once, accepting the sentence with the same quiet dignity he maintained throughout the trial. Mitchell put a hand on his shoulder, squeezing him up. But Rick knew better. The appeals process was a long shot, a lottery ticket for the desperate. Still, he appreciated the gesture, the refusal to give up, even when everything looked hopeless. As the marshals led him out of the courtroom, back toward the holding cell that would be the first of many in his journey through the federal prison system, Rick's mind was already working. Life in prison was meant to break him, to reduce him to nothing more than a number in the Bureau of Prisons database. But Rick had survived worse than this. He'd survived poverty, violence, betrayal, and the systematic destruction of his community. He would survive this too. The holding cell was colder than before, or maybe he just felt it more acutely now. He sat on the metal bench, feeling the weight of the sentence settle into his bones. Life, he thought about his mother, who'd raised him and his siblings in the projects with fierce determination. He thought about his children, who would grow up with a father behind bars. He thought about all the people he'd employed, who'd fed their families with money from an illegal economy because the legal one had abandoned them. And he thought about revenge. Not the violent kind, he'd left that behind years ago, but the kind that came from surviving, from refusing to let the system break you, from finding dignity and purpose even in the darkest places. That was the only revenge that mattered now. Henderson returned an hour later, this time with transport paperwork. You're heading to FCI Lompoc, he said. Medium security, could be worse. Rick knew about Lompoc. It was one of the older federal prisons in California, housing about 1,500 inmates in its medium security facility. The racial politics would be complex, the daily routines numbing, the violence sporadic but real. He'd have to navigate all of it while maintaining his sense of self, his dignity, his humanity. It wouldn't be easy, but nothing in his life had ever been easy. As the transport van pulled away from the courthouse, Rick watched San Diego disappear in the rearview mirror, the city fading into the California haze. Somewhere out there, Danilo Blandone was free, having testified against Rick in exchange for immunity. Somewhere, the CIA officers who facilitated the flow of cocaine into American cities were collecting pensions. Somewhere, politicians about being tough on crime while ignoring their own publicity and creating the crisis. But Rick Ross was going to prison for life. The injustice of it would have destroyed a lesser man. Rick felt it trying to take his chest, that bitter seed of rage and helplessness. He recognized it, acknowledged it, and then consciously set it aside. Bitterness was a luxury he couldn't afford. It would eat him alive if he let it, would turn him into exactly the kind of broken, violent inmate the system expected him to become. Instead, he would do what he'd always done, survive, adapt, and find a way to turn disadvantage into opportunity. He didn't know how yet, but he'd figure it out. He always did. The van turned onto the highway, heading north toward Lompoc and the beginning of a sentence that was meant to last forever. Rick closed his eyes, centering himself for the battles ahead. He was going to need every ounce of strength he had. The Federal Correctional Institution at Lompoc rose from the California landscape like a monument to punishment, its concrete walls and guard towers visible from miles away. Rick had been processed through reception over the course of 3 days, strip searches, medical exams, classification interviews, all designed to reduce a human being to a file folder and a number. He was now inmate 14238, mate 009, assigned to A block, cell 127. His cellmate was a middle-aged black man named Jerome Williams, serving 15 years for bank robbery. Jerome had the weathered look of someone who'd been institutionalized for so long that the outside world had become abstract, a memory more than a possibility. "They call me Rome," he'd said when Rick first arrived, extending a hand. "You're the Rick Ross, right? Freeway Rick." Word traveled fast in prison. Rick's reputation had preceded him, which was both an advantage and a liability. It meant other inmates would show him a baseline of respect, but it also meant he'd be tested. There were always young guys trying to make a name for themselves by challenging someone with status. "Just Rick," he'd replied, shaking Rome's hand firmly but not aggressively, trying to keep my head down and do my time. Rome had laughed at that, a bitter sound without humor. "Brother, you got life. Ain't no doing your time, you're just existing now. Might as well figure out how to exist with some dignity." That conversation had been 3 weeks ago. In that time, Rick had learned the rhythms of Lompoc, the invisible rules that govern daily life. The prison was divided along racial lines. Blacks, whites, Hispanics each had their own territories in the yard, their own tables in the chow hall, their own codes of conduct. Violence was relatively rare compared to higher security prisons, but when it happened, it was brutal and swift. Rick had connected with the black contingent as expected, though he kept a certain distance. He wasn't interested in gang politics or the various hustles that consume most inmates' energy. He spent his time in the library working on his reading with a determination that surprised even him. Books had become his escape, his education, his rebellion against a system that had condemned him to die in a cage. It was during his 4th week that the trouble started. Travis Kincaid was a white supremacist serving 25 years for armed robbery and assault. He was massive, 6'4", 230, most of it muscle maintained through obsessive weightlifting in the yard. He had the kind of dead eyes that suggested he'd crossed certain moral lines so many times they'd stopped existing for him. His tattooed swastikas and lightning bolts advertised his affiliations, and he ran the white power faction in A Block with the casual brutality of a feudal lord. Rick had noticed Kincaid watching him during meals, during yard time, during the shuffle to and from work assignments. It was the kind of attention that preceded violence. Rick had mentioned it to Rome, who grimaced and said, "Kincaid's got a problem with any black man who carries himself with pride. He especially hates anyone with a reputation from the streets. Says we're animals pretending to be human." He planning something? Probably. Question is when and where. You watch your back, Rick. That man is poison. The confrontation came on a Thursday afternoon in late summer. The rec yard was crowded, inmates clustered in their respective racial groups. Rick had been walking the track, a solitary exercise he used to clear his head, when Kincaid and 2 of his associates, both younger, both clearly following their leader's instructions, moved to intercept him. "Freeway Rick Ross," Kincaid called out, his voice carrying across the yard. Other inmates stopped what they were doing, recognizing the tone. "Something was about to happen. I've been hearing a lot about you. Big-time drug dealer, millionaire, king of Los Angeles." He said it all with mocking contempt. Rick stopped walking but didn't turn around immediately. He took a breath, centering himself. This was the test he'd known was coming. How he handled it would determine his next months, maybe years, in this place. When he did turn, his expression was neutral. "I don't know you," he said simply, "and I'm not looking for any trouble." Kincaid laughed and his 2 associates joined in on cue. "You're not looking for trouble? Boy, you're in prison for life. You are trouble, or at least you used to be. Now you're just another Ed." "Don't finish that word," Rick interrupted, his voice quiet but carrying an edge that made Kincaid pause. "You don't know me, you don't know what I've survived, what I've built, what I've lost. I'm asking you respectfully to step aside and let me continue my walk." For a moment, the yard seemed to hold its breath. The guards in the towers were watching but not intervening yet. They'd learned to let these confrontations play out unless weapons appeared. The other inmates had formed a loose circle, some hoping for violence, others dreading it. Kincaid stepped closer, invading Rick's space. "You think I'm scared of some drug dealer? You think your reputation means anything in here? This is my house. You're nothing but..." He didn't get to finish. Rick's mind had already processed the tactical situation. Kincaid was armed with a shank. Rick could see the outline of it tucked into his waistband. The 2 associates were positioning themselves to block any escape route. If Rick backed down, he'd be marked as weak, subject to constant predation. If he fought, he'd be playing into Kincaid's hands, giving him justification for whatever violence he'd already planned. But there was a third option. Rick looked directly into Kincaid's eyes and spoke loudly enough for everyone in the immediate vicinity to hear. "You want to stab me? Go ahead. I see the shank in your waistband. Everyone here sees it. The guards see it. You'll get what you want. You'll hurt me, maybe kill me. But you'll also get thrown in the SU for years. You'll lose whatever power you think you have here. And for what? To prove you're tougher than me. I already know you're tougher. You're bigger, stronger, more violent. Congratulations. That's not the question. Kincaid's expression flickered with uncertainty. This wasn't how these confrontations usually went. Rick pressed his advantage. The question is whether you're smart enough to recognize that I'm not your enemy. I'm doing my time same as you. I'm not challenging your authority. I'm not moving in on your business. I'm literally just trying to walk around this yard and read books in the library. If that threatens you, then go ahead and do what you're going to do. But know that everyone here will remember that Freeway Rick Ross stood up to you without throwing a punch, and you had to stab an unarmed man to feel like you won something. The silence stretched out. Rick could see the calculation happening behind Kincaid's eyes. The man was violent and racist, but he wasn't stupid. He understood prison politics, understood that this confrontation had already cost him something in terms of respect. If he stabbed Rick now, he'd look weak and desperate rather than powerful. But pride was a dangerous thing. You got a smart mouth for it. The explosion came without warning. Kincaid's fist crashed into Rick's jaw with the force of a hammer, sending him stumbling backward. Before he could recover, Kincaid was on him, driving him to the ground. Rick felt the concrete scrape his back, felt the weight of Kincaid's body pinning him down. He tried to defend himself, getting his arms up, but Kincaid was landing punches with methodical brutality, face, ribs, kidneys. Rick's training from years of street life kicked in. He couldn't match Kincaid's strength, but he could move, twist, make himself a harder target. He managed to get a knee up, catching Kincaid in the stomach, creating enough space to roll partially away. But Kincaid's associates were there, kicking him, keeping him down. Through the chaos, Rick saw Kincaid reach for the shank. Time seemed to slow down. Rick saw the crude blade coming out, saw the intent in Kincaid's eyes. He thought about his mother, his children, everything he'd survived. And he thought with a strange clarity that it would be deeply unjust to die like this, killed by a racist in a prison yard over nothing more than pride and hatred. Then the guards were there, batons swinging, voices shouting. Rick felt rather than saw Kincaid being pulled off him. He heard the sounds of struggle, of orders being barked, of inmates being forced to the ground. The shank clattered onto the concrete, visible evidence of what everyone had known was about to happen. Rick lay on his back, looking up at the California sky, tasting blood in his mouth. His ribs were screaming, his face felt like it had been run through a meat grinder, and his breathing came in short, painful gasps, but he was alive. A guard's face appeared above him, looking down with professional concern. "Don't move, Ross. Medical's on the way." Rick wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it. Don't move. As if he could, as if anything about this situation was within his control. But he managed a slight nod, acknowledging the order. As he lay there waiting for the medical team, Rick's mind was already working. This wasn't over. Kincaid would be in segregation for a while, but eventually he'd be back. And when he came back, he'd be angrier. The cycle of violence would continue unless Rick found a way to break it. But first, he had to survive the next few hours. The medical unit at Montauk was a sterile space that smelled of antiseptic and defeat. Rick sat on the examination table while a physician's assistant named Dr. Martinez, a tired-looking woman in her 40s, each touch of her fingers sent fresh waves of pain through his body, but he learned long ago not to show it. Showing pain was showing weakness, and weakness invited motivation. As we cracked ribs, she said one of themselves at him, her fingers probing his side gently. Significant contusions across the torso. Your left eye is going to swell shut. You're lucky the orbital bone isn't fractured. Split lip, probable mild concussion. She stepped back, making notes on her clipboard. You're going to hurt for a while, Mr. Ross. I've heard before, Rick said, his voice rough. Speaking made his lips bleed again, and he tasted copper. Dr. Martinez looked at him with something that might have been sympathy. I'm sure you have. I'm going to wrap your ribs, give you some ibuprofen. That's all I'm authorized to provide. No narcotics per facility policy. You'll heal, but it'll take time, and you need to avoid any strenuous activity for at least 6 weeks. Rick almost laughed. Avoid strenuous activity in prison where violence could erupt at any moment, where you had to be ready to defend yourself constantly. But he just nodded. Thank you, doctor. She wrapped his ribs with clinical precision, tight enough to provide support, but not so tight it restricted his breathing. The compression was agonizing. Rick had to focus on his breathing to avoid passing out. When she finished, she at 23 hours a day alone, 1 hour in a private yard that was little more than a concrete box. It was punishment and protection simultaneously, removing you from the population that wanted you dead while slowly eroding your sanity through isolation. I defended myself, Rick said. He came at me. Dr. Martinez's expression softened slightly. I know I saw the footage from the yard cameras, but it doesn't matter. Any inmate involved in a violent incident goes to the SHU while they figure out what happened and decide on discipline. It's the rules. The rules, Rick repeated, bitterness creeping into his voice despite his efforts to suppress it. 2 guards arrived to escort him, both younger men who'd probably been working at Lompoc for less than a year. They cuffed his hands behind his back, a fresh agony for his injured ribs, and led him through the institutional corridors to the segregation unit. The walk seemed to take forever, each step sending jolts of pain through his body. The SU was exactly as grim as he'd imagined. The cells were arranged along a long corridor, each door solid steel with a narrow slot for passing food trays. The guard stopped at cell 7, unlocked the heavy door, and gestured for him to enter. The space was approximately 7 feet by 12 feet, a metal bunk bolted to the wall, a stainless steel toilet and sink combination, a concrete shelf that served as a desk, no window, just a fluorescent light that would stay on 24 hours a day. The door closed behind him with a sound like a tomb ceiling. Rick stood in the center of the cell, taking in his new reality. This was where he would spend the foreseeable future, alone with his injuries and his thoughts. He carefully lowered himself onto the bunk, trying to find a position that didn't make his ribs scream. Eventually, he settled on lying on his back with his knees slightly bent, which seemed to distribute the pressure across his torso more evenly. The pain was extraordinary, a constant throb that pulsed with his heartbeat. But Rick had survived pain before, physical pain from fights, emotional pain from losses, the existential pain of watching his community destroy itself with the drugs he'd helped distribute. This was just another form of suffering to endure and overcome. He closed his eyes, forcing himself to breathe slowly and deeply, despite the sharp protests from his ribs. He needed to assess the situation rationally, without the fog of anger or fear. The facts were clear. Kincaid had attacked him without provocation, in front of witnesses and cameras. Rick had defended himself but hadn't initiated violence. By any reasonable standard, he should be the victim here, deserving of protection rather than punishment. But prison wasn't reasonable. The official account would likely blame both parties equally, or worse, suggest that Rick had provoked the attack through his attitude or reputation. The guards hadn't intervened until weapons appeared, which meant they'd been content to let the beating continue as long as it was just fists. That told Rick everything he needed to know about how much protection he could expect from the administration. The hours crawled by with excruciating slowness. Without a window, Rick had no sense of time beyond the meals that arrived through the slot in the door, breakfast, lunch, dinner, each one marking another 8-hour block of isolation. He forced himself to eat, knowing his body needed fuel to heal, even though his split lip made every bite painful. On the second day, a lieutenant named Graves came to interview him. Graves was an older black man, probably in his late 50s, with gray in his hair, and the careful neutrality of someone who'd learned not to show favoritism in a system that punished it. "Ross," he said, standing outside the cell door, notepad in hand, "I'm investigating the incident in the yard. I need to hear your version of what happened." Rick sat up carefully, wincing at the movement. Kincaid approached me while I was walking the track, started with verbal harassment, racial slurs. I tried to de-escalate, asked him to let me pass. He attacked me, I defended myself. Then his associates joined in, and I saw him reach for a shank. The guards intervened before he could use it. Graves wrote it all down without expression. Did you say or do anything that might have provoked the attack? I told him I wasn't looking for trouble. I acknowledged that he was tougher than me. I pointed out that stabbing me would land him in segregation and cost him his position in the hierarchy. "So you acknowledge his weapon?" Rick paused, recognizing the trap. "I observed what everyone else observed regarding Contra. It was on camera." Graves nodded slowly. Kincaid claims you disrespected him, challenged his authority in front of his people. He says the attack was about restoring order in the yard, and the shank Rick has straps in his leg. He said it was intention that he carries it because the black inmates have been threatening him. That was such obvious bullshit that Rick almost laughed, but laughing would hurt too much. "Lieutenant, you and I both know what happened. The question is whether the truth matters in a place like this." Something flickered in Graves' eyes, recognition perhaps, or respect for Rick's directness. "The truth always matters, Ross, but sometimes it's complicated by circumstances. Kincaid's going to issue for the weapon minimum 90 days. You're here for fighting, minimum 30 days. After that, we'll have to figure out how to keep you two separated when you return to general population." 30 days, Rick said, for defending myself against a racist with a shank. 30 days for being involved in a fight, regardless of who started it. That's policy. Be grateful it's not longer, and use the time wisely. Solitary can break a man or make him stronger. That's up to you. After Graves left, Rick lay back down, processing the injustice of it. 30 days in the SU, 30 days of isolation, of watching his mind play tricks on him, of fighting the gradual erosion of his sense of self that came from too much time alone. He'd heard the stories inmates who went into segregation solid and came out broken, paranoid, unable to function around other people. He couldn't let that happen. Rick began to construct a mental framework for survival. He would treat each day as a challenge to be overcome methodically. Physical exercise, despite his injuries, modified push-ups, careful stretching, anything to keep his body from atrophying. Mental exercise, too. He'd requested books before coming to the SHU, and the guards had brought him 3, a biography of Malcolm X, a book on basic mathematics, and ironically, a law textbook on criminal appeals. He would read, study, think. He would use this forced isolation to educate himself, to build the intellectual tools he'd never had access to as a young man struggling with literacy. If the system wanted to punish him by removing him from human contact, he would use that time to strengthen himself in ways they couldn't control. The pain in his ribs was a constant reminder of what he'd survived. Every breath hurt, but every breath also meant he was still alive, still fighting, still refusing to be broken by a system designed to destroy men like him. He thought about Malcolm X, who'd educated himself in prison, who'd emerged from confinement as one of the most powerful voices of his generation. If Malcolm could do it, so could Rick. On the third night, unable to sleep because of the pain and the constant fluorescent light, Rick began to plan his appeal. He wasn't a lawyer, but he understood the basics. His conviction had been based on entrapment by a government informant who was himself a criminal protected by the CIA. The drugs he'd sold had been part of a larger conspiracy that stretched from Nicaragua to South Central Los Angeles, a conspiracy that his prosecutors had conveniently ignored in their rush to put him away. It was a long shot. The appeals process favored the government, especially in drug cases, but it was something, a goal that extended beyond merely surviving each day. He would fight his conviction the same way he'd fought everything else in his life, with intelligence, persistence, and an absolute refusal to accept defeat. By the end of the first week, Rick had established a routine. He woke at 5 a.m. when breakfast arrived. After eating, he did modified exercises for an hour, careful not to aggravate his ribs, but determined to maintain his strength. Then he read until lunch, focusing intensely on the material, taking mental notes since he wasn't allowed paper and pen in segregation. Afternoon was for pacing his cell, thinking through problems, planning his future. Evening was more reading until the exhaustion finally let him sleep for a few hours despite the pain and the light. The psychological impact was real and undeniable. By day 10, Rick found himself talking to himself more frequently, filling the silence with his own voice, just to hear something human. He caught himself having conversations with people who weren't there, his mother, his children, even Kincaid, working through what he should have said, what he could have done differently. But he recognized these signs for what they were, his mind adapting to isolation by creating companionship. As long as he stayed aware of the process, as long as he didn't lose track of what was real and what was imagination, he could manage it. The ibuprofen helped minimally with the physical pain, but nothing touched the deeper ache of injustice, of knowing that every minute he spent in this cell was punishment for crimes that the government had facilitated. But Rick had learned something important over his years in the drug trade. You couldn't change the past, you could only shape your response to it. He would survive these 30 days. He would return to general population stronger, smarter, more focused than when he'd entered, and he would continue to fight in whatever ways were available to him against the system that had condemned him to die in prison for being a pawn in their larger games. On day 14, exactly halfway through his segregation sentence, Rick woke up and realized his ribs hurt less. The swelling in his eye had gone down enough that he could see clearly again. His lip had healed. His body was recovering, proving that it was resilient, that it could endure trauma and rebuild itself. If his body could heal, so could everything else. The days in segregation began to blur together, each one identical to the last in its brutal monotony. Rick had been in the SU for 21 days when he noticed the first real shift in his psychological state. It came during his morning exercise routine, a modified set of push-ups that he gradually expanded as his ribs healed. He'd done 15, then 20, then found himself completing 30 without the sharp pain that had characterized his first weeks. The realization hit him with unexpected force. His body had adapted. The injuries that had seemed catastrophic were now manageable, integrated into his physical reality rather than dominating it. If his body could do this, his mind could too. Rick sat on his bunk, sweating from the exertion, and allowed himself to examine the mental landscape he'd been carefully avoiding. The isolation had done things to his thinking, subtle shifts that he hadn't wanted to acknowledge. He'd caught himself having longer conversations with imaginary interlocutors, his mother mostly, sometimes his lawyer Mitchell, occasionally even his old supplier Blandone. These conversations had started as simple mental exercises, ways to process his thoughts, but they'd become more elaborate, more real feeling. He recognized the danger. The line between using imagination as a tool and losing the ability to distinguish reality from fantasy was thinner than most people realized. In segregation, where external stimuli were virtually non-existent, that line became almost invisible. So Rick made a conscious choice. He would acknowledge the voices, use them when they served his purposes, but he would never forget they were constructions of his own mind. It was a delicate balance, maintaining his sanity by entertaining controlled insanity. The Malcolm X biography had become his anchor to reality. He'd read it cover to cover 3 times now, absorbing not just the story but the methodology. Malcolm had been functionally illiterate when he entered prison, just like Rick. He'd educated himself through sheer force of will, copying the dictionary page by page to build his vocabulary. He transformed himself from a street hustler into one of the most articulate voices of the civil rights movement. Rick couldn't copy Malcolm's path exactly. He had different challenges, different circumstances, but the principle remained: education was power, self-improvement was resistance. Every page he read was a small act of rebellion against a system that wanted him to rot in a cell, forgotten and diminished. On day 23, a guard named Officer Chen brought his dinner tray and paused at the cell door. Chen was one of the younger guards, maybe 25, and unlike most of his colleagues, he occasionally showed signs of seeing inmates as human beings rather than case numbers. "Ross," he said through the slot, "you've got a visitor tomorrow, your lawyer. 10 a.m. You'll be brought to the attorney visiting room." Rick felt something loosen in his chest, anticipation maybe, or just gratitude for a break in the monotony. "Thank you, Officer Chen. You doing okay in there? I mean, mentally?" The question surprised Rick. Most guards didn't ask, didn't care. "I'm managing, keeping my mind active, reading a lot." Chen nodded. "That's good. I've seen what this place does to people. The ones who survive are the ones who find ways to keep their minds sharp. You seem like you're doing that." After Chen left, Rick considered the exchange. It was such a small thing, a brief moment of human connection, but it felt enormous after weeks of isolation. It reminded him that even in the most dehumanizing environments, individual kindness could survive. Small flowers pushing through concrete. The visit with Mitchell the next morning was both encouraging and frustrating. The attorney visiting room was a small space with a metal table and 2 chairs, separated from the rest of the facility, but still unmistakably part of the prison. Mitchell looked more tired than Rick remembered, his suit slightly rumpled, his briefcase covered in scuff marks that suggested constant travel between prisons and courthouses. "Rick," he said, shaking his hand firmly, "you look better than I expected. I heard about the incident with Kincaid." "I'm healing," Rick said simply. "What brings you here?" Mitchell pulled out a thick folder from his briefcase. "I've been working on your appeal. I wanted to update you on our progress and strategy." For the next hour, Mitchell walked Rick through the legal arguments they were constructing. The core of the appeal centered on government misconduct, specifically the fact that Danilo Blandon had been allowed to sell tons of cocaine with CIA knowledge and protection, then was given immunity to testify against Rick. They were arguing entrapment, selective prosecution, and violation of due process. It's a strong argument morally, Mitchell admitted, but legally it's an uphill battle. The courts generally defer to prosecutorial discretion. The fact that the government chose to prosecute you while protecting Blandon isn't technically illegal, even if it's deeply unjust. "So what are our chances?" Rick asked. Mitchell hesitated, and Rick respected him for not offering false hope. "Honestly, maybe 20%. But that's 20% more than zero. And there's growing media interest in your case, in the CIA Contra cocaine connection. Public pressure can sometimes influence judicial decisions even if judges claim otherwise." They talked for another half hour discussing strategy, timeline, and the possibility of eventually getting Rick's sentence reduced even if they couldn't overturn the conviction entirely. When the visit ended, Rick felt both energized and exhausted. Energized by the possibility of fighting back through legal channels, exhausted by the recognition of how long and uncertain that fight would be. Back in his segregation cell, Rick used the mental stimulation from Mitchell's visit to push himself harder. He began working through mathematical problems in his head, using the basic math textbook he'd been provided to construct increasingly complex calculations. If he couldn't have paper to write on, he'd strengthen his mental arithmetic until he could hold multi-step problems entirely in his mind. He also began planning what he would do when he returned to general population. The confrontation with Kincaid had established certain realities. Rick couldn't avoid violence entirely, but he could choose how he responded to it. He'd shown that he wouldn't be intimidated, that he'd stand up for himself even against superior force, but he'd also shown restraint, a willingness to de-escalate when possible. The key would be maintaining that balance, projecting strength without seeking confrontation, earning respect without making enemies unnecessarily. It would require careful navigation of the complex social dynamics in the prison, reading situations accurately, knowing when to stand firm and when to bend. By day 28, Rick could feel the end of his segregation sentence approaching. His body had fully healed from the beating. The ribs still ached occasionally, but the sharp pain was gone. His mind felt clearer, more focused than it had in months. The isolation, instead of breaking him, had given him time and space to consolidate his thoughts, to build mental frameworks that would serve him in the challenges ahead. On his final day in the SU, Rick woke before the breakfast delivery and sat in meditation, a practice he developed over the past week after reading about it in the Malcolm X biography. He focused on his breathing, on the sensation of air moving in and out of his lungs, on the simple fact of being alive in this moment rather than dwelling on past injustices or future uncertainties. When Officer Chen came to escort him back to general population, Rick was ready. He'd survived 30 days of solitary confinement. He'd healed from his injuries. He'd educated himself, maintained his sanity, and emerged stronger than when he'd entered. "You did good, Ross," Chen said quietly as they walked the corridors back to A block. "A lot of guys come out of the SU different, worse. You look like you came out better." Rick considered this. "It's all about mindset," he said. "They can control my body, where I go, what I do, but they can't control my mind unless I let them. I didn't let them." His cell in A block looked different somehow, less oppressive, almost welcoming compared to the sterile isolation of the SU. Rome was there, and his face broke into a genuine smile when Rick walked in. "And it's good to see you," Rome said, clasping his hand. "I heard Kincaid worked you over pretty good. But you're looking solid." "I'm okay," Rick said. "Better than okay. I used the time." "Used it how?" "To get stronger, mentally, mostly. You were right when you said I need to figure out how to exist with dignity. That's what I've been working on." Rome nodded thoughtfully. "Kincaid's still in the SU. They gave him 6 months for the shank, but his people are still around and they're not happy about what happened. You need to watch yourself." "I will," Rick assured him, "but I'm not going to live in fear either. I'm going to do my time the best way I know how, with my head up and my principles intact." That evening in the chow hall, Rick felt the eyes on him. Word had spread about the fight, about his month in segregation, about his upcoming appeal. Some of the looks were hostile, Kincaid's associates mostly. Others were curious or respectful. Rick met each gaze evenly, not challenging but not backing down either. He was Freeway Rick Ross, sentenced to life in prison for crimes the government had helped create. But he was also more than that. He was a man who'd survived poverty, the drug trade, betrayal, and now solitary confinement. He was a man who taught himself to read in his 30s, who built an empire through intelligence and determination, who refused to be broken by a system designed to destroy him. As he ate his institutional meal, surrounded by other men serving their own sentences for their own crimes, Rick felt something unexpected: hope. Not the naive hope that everything would work out, that his appeal would succeed and he'd walk free, but the deeper hope that came from knowing he could survive whatever came next, that he had the mental and emotional resources to not just endure but to grow stronger through adversity. The system had sentenced him to life imprisonment, but they couldn't sentence him to despair. They couldn't sentence him to giving up on himself, his dignity, or his humanity. That was something he would never give them. The weeks following Rick's return to general population fell into a rhythm that was both familiar and transformed by his time in the SU. He noticed things he hadn't noticed before: the subtle hierarchies in the recreation yard, the unspoken agreements that kept different factions from constant warfare, the way certain inmates moved through the space with the confidence of those who'd found their place in the institutional ecosystem. Rick had found his place too, though it wasn't what anyone might have expected. He'd become known as the man with books. His cell accumulated volumes borrowed from the prison library, requested from outside sources, traded with other inmates who valued knowledge over contraband. Rome had watched with amusement as their cell transformed into something resembling a study, with stacks of books on everything from law to history to philosophy crowding the limited space. "You're turning into a scholar, Rick," Rome observed one evening. "Never thought I'd see Freeway Rick Ross with his nose in a book about the Constitution." Rick looked up from his reading, a dense legal text on Fourth Amendment search and seizure law. "I'm trying to understand the system that put me here. You can't beat something you don't understand." "You think you can beat the federal government?" "I think I can fight them on their own terms. And even if I lose, I'll lose understanding why, which is better than just accepting defeat." Word of Rick's self-education spread through the prison population. Younger inmates began approaching him with questions, some about his past in the drug trade, which he deflected, and others about how to file appeals, understand their cases, or simply how to read better. Rick found himself becoming an informal tutor, spending his yard time explaining legal concepts or helping someone work through a difficult paragraph. It gave him purpose beyond simply surviving his sentence. It transformed time from something to be endured into something that could be used productively. 3 months after his return to general population, Travis Kincaid was released from his extended segregation. Rick heard about it through the prison grapevine before he saw the man himself. Rome had been worried, suggesting that Rick should request protective custody or at least stay alert for retaliation. But when Rick finally encountered Kincaid in the ratio yard, something unexpected happened. Kincaid approached alone this time, without his usual entourage. He still had the same dead eyes, the same tattooed symbols of hatred, but something in his posture had changed. He stopped a respectful distance away, not threatening Rick's personal space. "Ross," he said, his voice neutral. "Kincaid." A long silence stretched between them. Other inmates watched from a distance, uncertain whether violence was about to erupt. "I spent 6 months in the hole because of you," Kincaid said finally. "Spent 6 months in the hole because you pulled a shank," Rick corrected. "I just happened to be there." Kincaid's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue the point. "I did a lot of thinking in there about what you said that day, about being smart versus being tough." Rick waited, saying nothing. "I'm not saying I like you," Kincaid continued. "I'm not saying we're ever going to be friends, but I'm saying I'm done trying to kill you. You do your time, I'll do mine. We stay out of each other's way." It wasn't an apology exactly, but in the prison economy of respect and violence, it was as close as men like Kincaid got. Rick understood what it had cost him, not just the 6 months in segregation, but the loss of face in front of his faction, the admission that his approach had failed. "That works for me," Rick said, extending his hand. Kincaid stared at the hand for a long moment before taking it. The handshake was brief and firm, a formal acknowledgement rather than a gesture of friendship, but it represented something important, the end of active hostility, a truce that would make both their lives easier. As Kincaid walked away, Rome approached with an expression of disbelief. "Did I just see what I think I saw? Did Travis Kincaid just make peace with you?" "He made a practical decision," Rick said. "Same as I did in the yard that day. Sometimes the smart move is not fighting." The incident became part of Rick's growing reputation in Lompoc. He was the man who'd stood up to the most violent racist in the facility and survived. More than that, he was the man who turned a potentially lethal enemy into someone who left him alone. It was a different kind of power than what he'd wielded on the streets of Los Angeles, but it was power nonetheless. 6 months into his sentence, Rick received news that his initial appeal had been denied. Mitchell had called to break the news personally, his voice heavy with disappointment. They'd known it was a long shot, but the reality of the denial still hit hard. "We can appeal to the circuit court," Mitchell said, "but I want you to be realistic about the chances. The legal system is heavily weighted against overturning drug convictions, especially in cases like yours where the evidence was strong." Rick sat in the visiting room, processing the information. Part of him wanted to rage against the injustice of it. The government had sold him the drugs, entrapped him, and now refused to acknowledge their own misconduct. But rage wouldn't change anything. It would only consume energy he needed for survival. "File the next appeal," he told Mitchell. We keep fighting until there's nothing left to fight with." After the call, Rick returned to his cell and picked up the Malcolm X biography for what must have been the 10th time. He found the passage he was looking for, the section where Malcolm talked about his own transformation in prison. Malcolm hadn't just educated himself, he'd found a philosophy, a framework for understanding his place in the world and fighting for justice even from behind bars. Rick needed that too, not religion necessarily, though he had no objection to faith, but a philosophy, a way of making sense of his experiences that went beyond bitterness and victimhood. He began writing. The prison allowed inmates to have paper and writing implements, though everything was subject to inspection. Rick started keeping a journal, documenting his thoughts, his observations, his growing understanding of the systems that had shaped his life: poverty, racism, the war on drugs, the CIA's involvement in drug trafficking. The writing was slow at first. His literacy had improved dramatically, but composing coherent arguments still required intense concentration. Yet he persisted, filling page after page with his analysis of how the drug trade had functioned, how government policy had created the conditions for the crack epidemic, how men like him had been used as pawns in larger geopolitical games. He wrote about personal responsibility too. He didn't absolve himself of blame for his choices, didn't claim that government misconduct excused his own actions, but he insisted on context, on the full story, rather than the simplified narrative that painted him as simply a criminal who got what he deserved. 1 year into his sentence, Rick's journal had grown to over 200 pages. He showed sections of it to Rome, who read with growing amazement. "Rick, this is good," Rome said. "I mean, really good. You're explaining things I've felt my whole life but never had words for. You should try to get this published." Who's going to publish a book by a convicted drug dealer in federal prison? Somebody who cares about the truth. There are journalists out there covering the CIA cocaine story. There are activists fighting the war on drugs. Your perspective from the inside, from someone who actually lived it, that's valuable. The idea took root in Rick's mind. Publishing a book from prison would be nearly impossible, and even if he succeeded, it might not change anything about his sentence. But it would be another way of fighting back, of refusing to let his story be told only through the government's narrative. He began revising his journal with the goal of eventual publication, organizing the scattered thoughts into a coherent structure, adding detail and context where needed. It gave him a project that extended beyond the daily grind of prison life, something that connected him to the larger world outside the walls. 2 years in, Rick had become a fixture in Lompoc's informal education system. He taught a GED prep class, helping other inmates earn their high school equivalency. He continued his legal tutoring, assisting men with their appeals, even though his own continued to fail at every level. And he worked on his manuscript, which had grown to over 400 pages of analysis, personal history, and social criticism. The guards had noticed the change in him. Even Lieutenant Graves, who'd investigated the Kincaid incident, commented on it during a routine cell inspection. "Ross, I've been doing this job for 23 years, Graves said, flipping through Rick's manuscript with professional interest. "I've seen a lot of inmates come through these facilities. Most of them either break or they get harder, meaner, more bitter. You're doing something different." "What's that, Lieutenant?" "You're becoming more yourself, if that makes sense. Or maybe you're becoming who you should have been if the world had given you different opportunities. It's unusual." Rick considered this. "I've got life without parole, Lieutenant. I can either spend that life angry at what was taken from me, or I can spend it building something new. I choose to build." "What are you building?" Rick gestured at the books, the manuscript, the GED material stacked in the corner of his cell. "Understanding purpose, maybe eventually a way to help prevent other young people from making the mistakes I made." Graves nodded slowly. "Well, keep it up. The prison is better when inmates like you set the tone rather than guys like Kincaid." After Graves left, Rome looked at Rick with something like wonder. "You got a guard talking about you like you're some kind of role model. That's wild, Rick. That's not how this place usually works." "It's not about being a role model," Rick said. "It's about maintaining dignity. The system wants to reduce us to nothing but our worst choices, our criminal records. I refuse to accept that reduction. I'm more than the worst thing I ever did." This became Rick's philosophy, his framework for making sense of his incarceration. He was serving life for distributing cocaine, and that was a fact he couldn't change. But he wasn't defined by that single fact. He was also a self-educated man, a teacher, a writer, a son, a father, a human being with complexity and depth. The years continued to pass. Rick's appeals continued to fail. His manuscript grew until it was complete, a comprehensive account of his life, the drug trade, and the government's role in creating the crack epidemic. He found a journalist willing to help him shop it to publishers, though the process was slow and uncertain. But more importantly, he'd found a way to exist in prison with dignity. He wasn't free. He'd likely never be free again, at least not in his lifetime. But he was free in the only way that ultimately mattered. His mind was his own, his choices were his own, his identity was his own. He thought often about Malcolm X, about how prison had transformed him from Detroit Red into Malcolm Little, and eventually into one of the most powerful voices for justice in American history. Rick wasn't Malcolm. He didn't have the same gifts, the same opportunities, the same historical moment, but he could follow the same principle: use adversity as fuel for growth, use confinement as an opportunity for education, use injustice as motivation to fight for truth. 5 years into his sentence, Rick stood in the recreation yard and looked around at the world he now inhabited. He saw younger inmates who reminded him of himself at their age, lost, angry, making choices that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. He saw older inmates who'd given up, who moved through their days like ghosts, already dead inside, though their bodies still functioned. And he saw a precious few, who were fighting to maintain their humanity, to grow despite the system's efforts to break them. These were his people, his community. They were the ones he wrote for, taught for, fought for. Travis Kincaid walked past, and the two men exchanged a slight nod, not friendship, but acknowledgement. Even enemies could learn to coexist. Even in a place designed to bring out the worst in people, individuals could choose to be better than their circumstances demanded. Rick returned to his cell that evening and picked up his journal. He wrote about the day, about his observations, about the small victories that made life in prison bearable. And he wrote about hope, not the naive kind that believed everything would work out, but the stubborn kind that refused to surrender even in the face of overwhelming odds. The government had sentenced him to life in prison, but they hadn't sentenced him to hopelessness. They hadn't sentenced him to stop growing, learning, fighting for truth and justice, those things he'd chosen for himself, and no court in the country could take them away. As he finished writing and prepared for lights out, Rick felt something he hadn't expected to feel when he first arrived at Lompoc: peace. Not contentment with his situation, he would never accept the injustice of his sentence as right or proper, but peace with himself, with who he'd become, with how he'd chosen to respond to adversity. He'd been Freeway Rick Ross, the biggest cocaine dealer in Los Angeles history. He was now inmate 14238My009, serving life without parole in a federal prison. But more fundamentally, more importantly, he was simply Rick, a man who'd survived everything the world threw at him and emerged with his dignity intact. That was a victory no prison sentence could take away. That was a legacy worth leaving.